Here we go, end of the Vietnam War. Here comes Mr. Nixon and the peace accord in 1973 and a final pullout by 1975. Things aren't going to get better, although there's going to be promises of it getting better, but it'll actually get a little bit worse, maybe a lot of it worse in some ways. 1968, remember, it's kind of a crazy year. Tet Offensive, public opinion turning against the Vietnam War, Martin Luther King, and Bobby Kennedy's assassinated, riots across the country, D.C., Detroit. It's a crazy time. 1968, Eugene McCarthy, Democrat from Minnesota, challenges him. LBJ, speaking of him, Robert Kennedy's challenging him. Both of them polling pretty well, and it's not looking very good. And then when Bobby Kennedy is assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan, he's out, and Democrats choose at the Democratic National Convention this guy from Minnesota, Hubert H. Humphrey, who's promising to basically finish the war and uphold the path to defending against communist aggression over there. Riots outside of that convention hall, massive riots, about 90 million people see it on TV, and it significantly has an impact on this election outcome. Police attacking protesters. Richard Nixon, his vice president, is going to be a guy by the name of Spiro Agnew. He's going to run with a strategy to try and gain votes from the South. Conservative Southern Democrats discussed with civil rights, the anti-war protests. He's going to pitch significantly law and order and maybe a more controlled desegregation in a way. Later on is what will develop after this. He's going to have his convention for his party in Miami, pledging an honorable peace, similar to Humphrey. We're not going to lose this war, in other words. There's a third candidate here. The American Independent Party chooses a guy by the name of George Wallace. You've seen him before in resistance to integration under the Kennedy administration. There again is the federal government. There's the state government resisting him alone and other students getting into that University of Alabama. He was the governor at that point in time. Segregationist, not former, he was a segregationist, but former segregationist governor of Alabama, and promises law and order just like Mr. Nixon does. But advocated a really strong hard line in Vietnam. We'll bomb North Vietnam back in the Stone Age, use our technology. That's one of the big mistakes of the Vietnam War, was that we have all this great technology. There's just no way they can outlast us and deal with the big, powerful United States military. And the results are that Mr. Wallace, unsurprisingly, carries the Deep South. You can notice our coloring down here, but the rest of the country goes red. An experienced former vice president under Republican Eisenhower. Things are crazy. Things need to go in a different direction. He's promising basically that there's going to be a solution to Vietnam, and it's a tight vote here for Mr. Nixon. Really not a strong, clear mandate and everything, but he's going to announce in 1969 that he has a secret plan to end the war. He really doesn't, but he continues to wage war for about 4 more years. But there is going to be a shift in how it's waged. Another 20,000 people dying here in all of this. In 1969, the lottery draft is established, the old draft by draft status. Check out the handout I gave you. The further down the line you go on that list, the less likely you're going to be drafted. Again, the key was if you could go to college, you could get out of the draft. There are some other ways in which you can get out of the draft as well, but no longer are deferments a possibility. So they kind of set things up by birth date, and they just randomly drew. Recognize that guy? Cassius Clay at the time became Muhammad Ali. He was pressured to sign up for the draft also and resisted. You can look up his story. But the important topic here for Nixon is Vietnamization. This is going to be a call for let the Vietnamese people do more of the fighting, reduce troops, make sure, put down here and annotate, reduce American troops. So we'll still give Vietnam money, weapons, training. The South Vietnamese will take it over though. And so this is a move away from what LBJ had done and maybe more something toward what Kennedy had done. But still, American soldiers are going to be doing some fighting here. By 1973, troops will be reduced from 500,000 to 23,000. But notice what's going to take its place. What's going to take its place is bombing attacks from the air significantly. And here again is 1968, the election. And look at the big spike in the bombings, a little bit down, back up, down and back up, down and back up. And as these bombings increase significantly, the number of troops under Nixon's administration decreases pretty significantly. But again, 20,000 people are still, Americans are still going to die. The My Lai massacre occurs in 1969, and this basically is one of those events where Americans, very distressed and maybe not thinking very clearly, overreacting, losing control, in particularly this case, this Lieutenant William Calley gives an order to go ahead and shoot, massacre 347 civilians, men, women, and children at this village called My Lai. And it's really from this point in time on that you start hearing the message baby killer and American veterans coming after the war from their 1-year term of service, 3 months of training, and the rest of it in country. They get off of the big planes at the airports, and they're confronted with protesters calling them baby killers. And this is a very unwelcome end to the war for large numbers of, and most, Vietnam veterans. And with this announcement for a new strategy, Vietnamization, let the Vietnamese fight more of the war, Nixon makes a speech to the nation in November of 1969, and it's called his silent majority speech. And he denounces the doves and protesters for their actions, although he recognizes their right to protest, but they're really not the majority of people. They're about maybe 15% of the entire population of the youth in the country, the protesters that are out there who are active. And it's the middle class of Americans who go to work every day, they go to church, they do their thing, they're not out protesting, they support the war with their silence, and they're really in the majority. And so he calls on those middle class Americans, again, the familiar America, maybe, perhaps you might say, and suburbia, to support him in his new strategy of Vietnamization. And it's kind of symbolized the backlash against liberalism, the protests, and the actions that are going on in those particular protests throughout the countries. And so in 1969, there is established a secret bombing of the countries that contain the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Try to cut off, as before, supply lines on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Eventually, it'll become public in 1973. He'll also announce on TV that we're sending troops into Cambodia to clear out communists and disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This will become very unpopular. It's so unpopular that there's just massive protests on college campuses in the hundreds across the country. And in one particular case at Kent State, some National Guardsmen end up shooting and killing some students who were not protesting and innocent bystanders. This, of course, is seen on TV at Jackson State, Mississippi. There's some massive gunfire going on there as well, and 2 college students die as well. College campuses shut down across the country, and it's chaos. And these things are increasingly turning public opinion against the war. And so, with this event, Congress repeals the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, but the action in Vietnam is still going to involve some significant bombing. So theoretically, it's supposed to be pulling back power away from the president. But the President Nixon now, is not going to leave without or with anything that's looking like a loss. But what comes out, and as a turning point also in the Nixon administration toward the end of the war, is this event called the Pentagon Papers in 1971. A defense worker who worked at the Pentagon, Daniel Ellsberg, leaked some Pentagon war documents during Lyndon Johnson's presidency to the Washington Post and a couple other newspapers, at least one other. And basically, it was some papers and documents about a study that the Pentagon did about the Vietnam War and how we got involved and what was behind it. And it wasn't supposed to be released. And so it traces this history over 3 decades and what was really behind it. Richard Nixon's daughter gets married in the White House in particular in that year. And with this, Nixon tries to block the publication of this information because he doesn't want the government to look bad or the administration to look bad or to hurt his effort to get out of the Vietnam War with honor, and tries to put Ellsberg in jail. And the court case, New York Times, the other paper that's getting some of this information, versus the U.S., the Supreme Court rules that the newspapers may go ahead and and publish this information to the public. They have a right to know. Excellent movie, The Post, portrays this process, referring to the Washington Post and this whole event. And what this really revealed, the Pentagon Papers revealed that the government misled Congress and the public about its intentions in Vietnam. That fighting in Vietnam wasn't to eliminate communism, but it was really to avoid a humiliating political defeat, at least at some point. And so this Gulf of Tonkin incident also was revealed as something in which it wasn't provoked. We were there in territorial waters. We were conducting some covert actions and involvement in North Vietnam itself, and that we maybe even perhaps wanted to provoke this attack to escalate our involvement there. And so with this, there's a significant amount of mistrust that increases across the country for the government. This, of course, is going to get worse with the Nixon administration. And by 1972, we're seeing some attempts to pull back. The United States will withdraw from Cambodia. The bombing, though, will continue. The bombing is going to continue to try and keep up the pressure on the North Vietnamese government to continue to negotiate an honorable end to the war. But in 1972, when we pull out of Cambodia and we seem to reduce some of our troop presence there, they attack across the DMZ at the 17th parallel, and then the bombing increases again. It does halt the advance of North Vietnam, but 1972 is kind of an important year, another even year, another election. It's a presidential election, and the president wants something positive to come out of this. And his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, important dude here in all this, asserts that, you can fill in the blanks with what you see here in the headline, place it right over there, that peace is at hand. Hang on, people, peace is at hand. We've got this just about wrapped up. Vote for Nixon is kind of really the message in all this. And so with this election, he wins in November of 1972, and the war isn't technically really done yet, but the bombings increase as the North Vietnamese seem to be negotiating. Then they pulled out, and so in come the bombers to put pressure on them again, and that does force them back to the negotiating table. And you can kind of see here, remember Guam, Spanish-American War, that's what we got that from. Very close to the Philippines, right here as well. The bombers are launching from there, and Japan, and all kinds of different places. Here's Okinawa. Japan's up in this area in the Pacific. Round-the-clock bombing, nonstop. And so the Paris Peace Accords are signed in 1973, and the agreement is made that the North will stop within 60 days. POWs will be returned within about 60 days. The United States will withdraw forces from Vietnam, and the territory that is controlled there will supposedly be under control, as you see in the map here, will still be under control of communist North Vietnam, but there's not a lot in gray left over here for South Vietnam. I'm not sure really how that was going to work, but basically the last combat troops leave, and by 1973, and by the time we get to April 1975, South Vietnam was completely overrun by North Vietnamese tanks. They crossed the 17th parallel. Communism wins in the Cold War in this one. So Korea was a draw. Here was a win, and we're out of Vietnam. And again, these people are Vietnamese people trying to get out on American helicopters and ships that come to the United States significantly in the 1960s. You know that with the Immigration Act of 1965, there's a big shift there from Asia, of immigrants coming in from Asia at this time and Latin America. But the war is over in 1973, and South Vietnam falls in 1975. War statistics, you can see the growth of service members, the number of people dead who have died in the war by state. 58,000 plus died, 300,000 wounded, 2,538 missing in action. POWMIA Association is formed. Troops and casualties over time in the chart. A little bit better. Casualties by war. Here's our Civil War, World War II, and the Persian Gulf War. Vietnam in there relatively as well. In terms of Vietnam, 2 million people dead, 300,000 missing in action. It's just a travesty of an event that for a war and for the reasons that it's fought. It's kind of a mess. Yeah, you can see they're a little bit different format. But what are some of the results? Well, it's costing a whole lot of money. It's going to have a really bad impact on the economy of the United States into the 1970s. We'll talk about that in the next unit. It's going to really kind of like World War I. It's going to draw some attention away from progressive programs. And like this cartoon here kind of shows how the war and the military put a lot of pressure on the Great Society programs and maybe limited and overrode the impact or the positive aspect of the Lyndon Johnson administration. Again, inflation, a stagnant economy is going to be the result in the 1970s. But the draft is abolished, and we have an all-volunteer army being established. In 1971, the 26th Amendment is a positive result out of it in that now equality is established in terms of the draft versus voting. If you're drafted into the military, you can die at 18, but now you can also vote at 18. That just seems to be the fair, right thing to do. So our 26th Amendment gets established there, and our memorial for the Vietnam War veterans is established in 1982 in Washington, D.C. Every single name of 58,000 plus people is inscribed on that monument. I encourage you to go check it out someday. That's the end of our Vietnam War. Make sure you get your left side done, a little bit of review, graphic organizer, mind map, something to answer the essential question, and check out the Creedence Clearwater Revival song that I attached there for you. Do a little critique of it. Match it up to the Martin Luther King and John Kerry document. Try to find some similarities there. Good stuff. I'll throw some more Vietnam War protest music up for you so you can check that out in your free time. Make hay.